Hey there dirt bike people, I'm Chuck from TrueTech, and today I'm going to show you how to change the clutch dampers on a modern TPI. I get a lot of TPIs in with the complaint that the clutch is dragging either at low RPM or when the clutch is all the way in. If the bike's got really low hours, the clutch dampers are very likely at fault. I often see them worn out by the time the bike hits 20 or 30 hours. After you get the clutch cover off, you'll see 6 bolts, which I've pulled out, and this ring, and the Belleville spring. After that, you can pull off this little steel ring, the pressure plate, and the throwout or the hat. Now checking the clutch dampers is really simple. You just put your fingers on this plate and give it a wiggle. If there's play, like in this one, they're worn out. Now in order to get at the dampers, we need to fold the tabs back on the locking washer and pull the nut off. Here I'm just using a flat blade screwdriver and a small ball peen hammer. While you're doing this, be careful not to let the screwdriver slip. There are lots of little aluminum parts that are very easy to break. Ask me how I know. Now to get the nut off, I just hit it with an impact. I don't own a clutch holding tool. I think they're just a waste of time. Now I'm going to pull the washer off, and then we can pull out this whole plate. In order to do that, I just use a pick tool and gently pry at it. It can be a little bit stuck, so don't break your pick tool. Oftentimes, half the dampers come along with the plate. Now, technically, we wouldn't really have to go any further. We could just replace the dampers, but while we're in here, we might as well check the clutch plates, and it's definitely easier to replace the dampers with the inner clutch basket laying flat on the bench. At this point, I usually just pull out the whole inner hub assembly, plates and all. No sense not checking the basket for grooving. This one is polished, but not notched. Now we can pull out all the clutch plates. Sometimes these little pins come with it, and that's fine. You can just put them back. Now I'm going to look through these plates to check their condition. I'm looking for burnishing or discoloration on the steel plates and charring or glazing on the frictions. Now you can see on these steel plates that there is a bunch of discoloration towards the inner circumference, and I wasn't sure if that would cause an issue or not. So I put the steels back in this case, then I test rode the bike and found that the clutch was dragging significantly, so I did after this replace all of the clutch plates. Rekluse makes a kit that replaces all of the clutch dampers and also gives you a new lock tab washer, which is really nice. And riders are reporting that they're getting significantly more life out of the Rekluse dampers over the stock ones. Now really the only thing to remember with this is this little connecting piece needs to go down and towards the outside of the basket, and then this plate can go back in. Sometimes the dampers are kind of folded in together, and so you got to use a tiny little flat screwdriver to kind of pry them apart, but just usually wiggling this plate will make it happen. Once you do this, you'll see the difference between the play that you had initially versus how tight the plate actually slides into the dampers. Now it's just reassembly. Don't forget this washer behind the inner hub. It's oftentimes stuck to the back of the inner hub. And in this case, these pins are kind of sticking to the inner hub quite nicely, but sometimes they fall out and it's okay. You can put them in after, as long as you put them in before you start putting the plates in. Now, in case you mixed up the order of the plates, the first plate is a thin one. It should be 1 millimeter, and then you just alternate frictions and steels, and then the last plate to go in is also a thinner one at 1 millimeter, and then we can install the new washer and the nut. Now at this point there's a few variables. If you're using the stock lock washer setup, the manual calls for blue Loctite and 100 Newton meters of torque. If you're using the Rekluse tab washer, it calls for 50 foot-pounds. I simply grab my impact, give it a couple of ugga-duggas, because I know that the only purpose of this nut is to hold the clutch assembly together. You don't want to squish any of the bearings or anything, but other than that, as long as it's snug and the lock tab washer is bent over, you're good to go. That being said, I do have a lot of experience with my impact. I use it every single day, and if you're not confident doing it this way, use the recommended torque spec. Now that we've got the lock tabs bent over, we can install the hat. Now when you're installing the pressure plate, it's important to line up the holes. A lot of times this little steel ring that we mentioned earlier is still stuck to the pressure plate, and that's just fine. The ring has a little stamp in it that says top, and that's the side that goes out. Now with these little clutch spring bolts, I think it's actually quite irresponsible to use a torque wrench. There's simply too many variables. I put a little bit of blue Loctite into each one, and then I tighten them carefully by hand. Then after that, the Belleville spring goes on, and then this little collar. The collar has 3 different positions that determine the preload on the Belleville spring. Most of the collars will be set in position number 2 like this one is. The purpose of the different settings on the collar is to account for clutch plate wear, but it's extremely rare for clutch plates to actually wear down enough to change positions on the collar. Most of the time they get glazed over or the steels will warp before that happens. In most cases, if you weren't having any significant trouble with your clutch before you took it apart, you probably want to put the screws back where they came from. If you do want to check the deflection of the Belleville spring, which determines which position the collar is in, you can find that information in the manual. Basically, the Belleville spring should be seeing about 4 thou deflection. Now I'm just going to run these in with my impact to save some time, and then I'm going to do a final tighten with my hand. And that's the end of the technical bit. If this O-ring is damaged, you want to replace it, but as long as it's sticking proud, it'll do the job just fine. This is another place where I tighten all the bolts by hand because these little M6 holes are very sensitive, and it's very easy to strip them if you try and use a torque wrench. Of course, don't forget to install this little brake spring here and fill the transmission with oil, and you're good to go. If you like this video, please let the algorithm know by giving me a thumbs up. If you want more of this type of content, go ahead and subscribe and hit the little notification bell. If you want to see what I'm doing on a more day-to-day basis, you can find that type of content on Instagram. Thanks for watching. I appreciate your time.